The marble floors of the St. Louis courthouse gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, each step echoing in a silence thick with expectation. Jasmine Hayes entered courtroom, 4 billion with a presence that demanded respect, her black suit pressed to perfection, her chin lifted with a quiet defiance that came not from arrogance, but from knowing exactly who she was. She had worked her entire life to be here. She had weathered storms no one had seen, small humiliations, subtle exclusions, the kind of prejudice so deeply embedded it often went unnoticed by those who had never felt its sting. Yet today she moved with the confidence of someone who understood her worth could not be measured or diminished by the shallow gaze of others. Sorry to interrupt the story. Before we continue, we'd really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us get closer to 1,000 subscribers. It means the world to us. Thank you so much. But prejudice, raw and unmasked, still lurked in places power should have made sacred. At the security checkpoint, it wore a uniform. Officer Scott Ramsey, a man whose very posture dripped with entitlement, stood between Jasmine and the courtroom doors. His eyes narrowed the moment they landed on her, not in curiosity, but in suspicion. Jasmine presented her FBI badge, official, valid, undesirable. She had done this hundreds of times before, in cities big and small, in rooms filled with doubt. Yet she had never grown numb to the chill that came when her identity was not just questioned, but denied. Ramsey sneered as if her credentials were a personal affront. Without verifying, without pause, he reached out and snatched her badge from her hand as if she had no right to hold it. "This is fake," he growled loud enough for the gathered crowd to hear. The hum of conversation died instantly. Before she could utter a word, his hand gripped her arm, twisting it behind her back with a force that spoke not of procedure, but of disdain. The sharp metallic snap of handcuffs filled the room, louder than any gavel strike. Her cheek pressed against the cold wooden railing, and for a moment the world narrowed into a painful, suffocating silence. No one moved. No one spoke. Judges, lawyers, defendants, and journalists alike watched, their eyes wide, their mouths closed. Some pulled out phones, capturing the spectacle, but none stepped forward to intervene. In that moment, Jasmine felt the crushing weight of every lesson she had learned growing up, a reminder that no title, no badge, no suit could armor her fully against the deep, instinctive bigotry that could strip her down in seconds. She was no longer an agent, no longer a professional. To Ramsey, she was simply another black woman in the wrong place at the wrong time. Her wrists burned under the pressure of the cuffs, but the fire that ignited inside her heart burned even hotter. It was not rage, it was a promise. A promise that humiliation would not be the final word. Jasmine closed her eyes for a brief moment, summoning the stillness that had carried her through a lifetime of being underestimated. When she opened them again, her gaze was steady, her voice low but certain. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," she whispered, not to threaten but to promise. Ramsey laughed, smug and oblivious to the avalanche he had just unleashed. Around them, the silence of the crowd deepened, heavy with the knowledge that they were witnessing a storm long overdue. Long before Jasmine Hayes stood handcuffed in a courtroom, before the weight of systemic prejudice wrapped its hands around her wrists, she had already learned what it meant to carry invisible armor. She had built it layer by layer, growing up in the simmering heart of Birmingham, Alabama, a city where every cracked sidewalk and every warning taught survival as a second language. In Birmingham, history didn't live in textbooks. It lived in the way shopkeepers watched her too closely. It breathed through the for sale signs that never made it to her side of town. It spoke through the way even smiles could carry a hint of fear or disdain, depending on which side of the street she walked. Jasmine's mother, a hospital nurse who worked nights and weekends, taught her early, "You don't get to make mistakes." In a world eager to magnify her flaws and dismiss her achievements, perfection wasn't a goal, it was armor. Her father had disappeared before she turned 12, another silent casualty of a world that swallowed dreams like hers whole. She learned not to wait for heroes. She learned to become one for herself. By 15, Jasmine had memorized an unspoken code. Don't raise your voice. Don't show fear. Keep your ID visible at all times. Smile just enough to seem non-threatening, but never enough to invite false familiarity. Never give them an excuse to forget your humanity. The lessons weren't written in any book. They were handed down like heirlooms, stitched into every cautious glance, every carefully measured step. And though they weighed heavy on her young shoulders, they also taught her how to stand when everything around her pushed her to kneel. While others found pathways smoothed by connections or privilege, Jasmine carved her own through sheer, relentless will. Her entry into the FBI wasn't paved with recommendations or favors. It was built on nights where she studied until dawn, mornings when she wore the thinnest armor of confidence over the thickest skin of necessity, and countless days when she forced herself to walk into rooms that weren't designed to welcome her. And yet she refused to let bitterness root itself in her heart. She carried her history with dignity, refusing to be defined by it, but never forgetting the price she paid for every step forward. Her strength wasn't loud. It wasn't brash. It was the quiet, bone-deep resilience that comes from knowing the world may see your skin before it sees your soul and deciding to show them both anyway. Now, standing in a detention room with red marks blooming across her wrists, Jasmine felt not defeat, but a grim kind of clarity. This humiliation was not new. It was not an isolated act. It was the latest chapter in a lifelong story of resistance, a story she knew by heart, one that had never broken her, only sharpened her resolve. They thought they could erase her with a pair of handcuffs. They didn't understand she had been unbreakable long before they ever laid hands on her. As the cold steel of the handcuffs bit into her wrists and the courtroom fell into a stunned, complicit silence, Jasmine Hayes' mind did not spin into panic. Instead, her focus sharpened into something crystalline and deadly precise. At her feet, the brown leather briefcase she had carried so carefully tumbled to the floor, unnoticed by the officer who now manhandled her like she was no more than a trespasser. Inside that briefcase, neatly organized and meticulously secured, was the truth, a truth heavy enough to crush not just Scott Ramsey, but the entire network of corruption he had helped weave. The USB device, tucked into a hidden compartment, carried recordings, body cam footage, sworn affidavits, all indisputable evidence, exposing a pattern of abuses Ramsey and his associates had long buried under lies, threats, and silence. And now, in his arrogance, in his eagerness to humiliate her publicly, Ramsey had not only revealed his own prejudice, he had unknowingly laid the groundwork for his own destruction. He saw only what he wanted to see: a black woman out of place, a badge he decided wasn't real, a target easy to dismiss and harder to respect. He thought a display of force would intimidate her, reduce her to another nameless figure whose protest would be too soft, too small to matter. But Jasmine Hayes had not spent a lifetime climbing through barbed wire just to be undone by the ignorance of a man like him. As she knelt, her cheek pressed against the polished wood, she felt the burn of humiliation, yes, but alongside it surged something far greater, the knowledge that he had just undone himself. She was no longer merely a witness to injustice. She had become its prosecutor. The world Ramsey thought he controlled, the system he believed would protect him, was already shifting under his feet. Videos were already being captured. Whispers were already spreading through the crowd. His sneer, his laughter, his casual cruelty, they were all becoming evidence now too. Jasmine closed her eyes briefly, not from fear, but from certainty. When she opened them again, she turned her head just enough to fix him with a gaze so calm, so unshakably sure, that it rattled him in ways he could not yet comprehend. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," she whispered, her voice cutting through the stillness like a blade wrapped in velvet. He laughed dismissively, tightening the cuffs, still blind to the reckoning that was now inevitable. But deep down, somewhere beneath the hollow bravado, a crack had begun to form. Because even the most corrupt recognize on some primal level, when the tides have turned, and by the time Ramsey realized it, the current would already be too strong to escape. The footage spread with a force no one could control, videos of a black federal agent humiliated in a courthouse meant to symbolize justice. Jasmine Hayes' handcuffed figure became a rallying cry overnight. News outlets exploded. Social media seethed. But through the noise, Jasmine stayed silent, not because she was defeated, but because she knew justice required more than outrage, it required precision. The next day she returned, same black suit, same briefcase, same unbreakable calm. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, but Jasmine walked through them as if she didn't hear a word. Inside the courtroom, eyes followed her every step. With steady hands, she placed the USB drive on the table. As the evidence rolled across the screen, altered bodycam footage, falsified reports, Ramsey's unmistakable voice giving corrupt orders, the room froze. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Every piece of evidence spoke louder than any outrage could. She wasn't just reclaiming her place, she was dismantling the very arrogance that thought it could erase her. This was no longer about proving her worth. It was about exposing the truth and making sure the world never looked away again. The courtroom, once a fortress of intimidation, now sat in stunned silence. The screen flickered with damning evidence, audio recordings, falsified reports, altered body camera footage, each revelation cutting deeper than last. Jasmine Hayes stood firm, her voice steady as she walked the jury through each piece. She didn't need theatrics. The truth itself was relentless. Jasmine Bull. Every recording played was another crack in the armor of Officer Scott Ramsey, exposing the rot beneath his badge. Ramsey sat frozen at first, his confidence bleeding from him with each passing second. Sweat gathered at his temples. His hands clenched and unclenched beneath the table. By the time Jasmine played the recording of him laughing while instructing another officer to fabricate charges, his composure shattered completely. "This is a lie," he barked across the room, his voice cracking under the weight of desperation. "She set me up." But no one moved to defend him. No one looked away from the screen where his own voice betrayed him again and again. Jasmine remained still, her gaze locked on the judge, never once acknowledging Ramsey's outbursts. She knew better than to let chaos pull her from her purpose. She had been underestimated before. She had been silenced before. But today, the walls of Jasmine L were crumbling around her, and she did not intend to blink. Piece by piece, she dismantled the illusion Ramsey had built for years, the illusion of authority without accountability. Every lie he had told, every life he had damaged, now stood in the open, Jasmine Bull and irreversible. By the time Jasmine placed the final USB drive into the evidence box, the courtroom no longer saw Ramsey as a figure of authority. They saw him for what he was, a coward hiding behind a badge he no longer deserved. And for the first time in a long time, Jasmine felt the heavy, solemn weight of justice beginning to shift, not in her favor, but in favor of the truth. The judge's gavel struck the desk with a resounding crack, silencing the final echoes of Ramsey's desperate Jasmine L's. In the heavy electric stillness that followed, the authority he once wielded drained from him like air from a punctured tire. "Officer Scott Ramsey," the judge's voice was steady, but the disappointment behind it was unmistakable. "You are hereby ordered into immediate custody for obstruction of justice and conspiracy to interfere with a federal investigation." Ramsey's mouth moved, but no words came out. His face twisted in disbelief as two deputies approached, firm and unhurried. For years he had commanded rooms with fear, with swagger, with the unspoken protection of a system that preferred blindness to confrontation. But not today. Today, the system looked back. And it did not flinch. The metallic snap of the handcuffs closing around Ramsey's wrist rang out through the courtroom, a brutal echo of the sound Jasmine had felt 6 months before when he had so casually humiliated her. Now, it was he who stood exposed, powerless under the very laws he once twisted against others. "You believe her?" he stammered, a wild edge creeping into his voice. "You're choosing her over me." No one answered. No one needed to. The evidence had already spoken louder than any defense he could offer. As he was led away, shoulders hunched, head bowed, not in dignity but in defeat, Jasmine stepped forward, not to gloat, not to taunt, but to remind him of a truth he had never understood. She leaned in just enough for him to hear her whisper. "You didn't think I would have the last word, did you?" Ramsey's eyes flickered, a flash of rage and regret, but it no longer mattered. His reign had ended not in a blaze of authority, but in the quiet, devastating force of the truth he had long tried to suppress. And as Jasmine watched him disappear through the courtroom doors, she felt no triumph, only the solemn understanding that justice, real justice, demanded more than exposing one man. It demanded perseverance. It demanded memory. And above all, it demanded that no one, not even those with badges, be allowed to stand above the law. Ramsey's arrest was only the beginning. As the dust settled, Jasmine and her team pushed deeper, determined to uncover just how far the corruption reached. Working with her attorney Celeste and Officer Blake Simmons, a man once trapped inside the same broken system, Jasmine reopened old cases, cases dismissed without reason, cases that now screamed with patterns too familiar to ignore. One file led to another, And soon a horrifying picture emerged. A network of falsified charges, silenced whistleblowers, and abuses swept under bureaucratic rugs. Among the buried cases was the story of a young officer, long forgotten, who had tried to expose misconduct 5 years earlier, and had ended up dead, his death ruled a suicide despite evidence that now pointed to murder. Jasmine knew then Ramsey was just a symptom. The disease was bigger, deeper, and it demanded more than one conviction. It demanded a reckoning. And for the first time it felt within reach. Jasmine Hayes stood on the steps of the courthouse, hailed as a hero. Reporters clamored for her words. Officials offered handshakes and praise. She accepted it all with a composed smile, but inside a different storm raged. Justice had been served, yes, but at a price invisible to cameras, sleepless nights, death threats. The cold stares that lingered even now from those who thought she had gone too far. She had exposed a broken system, forced a city to confront its own rot, but she knew the fight wasn't over. Corruption didn't vanish with a single conviction. It adapted, it waited. Later that night, sitting alone in her small apartment, Jasmine stared at the medal lying on the table. It glittered under the soft lamp light, a token of victory. Yet all she could feel was the weight of every silent battle she had fought to get here. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and reminded herself the scars were proof she hadn't given up, and she never would. This was never just Jasmine Hayes' story. It was a mirror held up to a system too long blind to its own reflection. It was a reminder that strength isn't always found in loud protests or violent retaliation. Sometimes it's in the steady voice that refuses to waver, in the hands that hold evidence when others hold weapons, in the quiet, stubborn refusal to be erased. Jasmine's battle showed that change doesn't come with applause. It comes with scars, with loneliness, with the slow, grueling work of standing alone until others find the courage to stand with you. She proved that one voice, calm, unbreakable, can tear through walls built to silence generations. And now, the question remains for all of us. When the system turns its back, will you have the courage to face it? When justice falters, will you be the one to hold the line? Because real change begins not with crowds, but with a single, unwavering stand. 1 year after the courtroom erupted with the truth, the city of St. Louis had changed, but change, Jasmine Hayes knew, was never simple, never smooth. The headlines had faded. The protests had quieted. Yet the real work, continued in the quiet spaces few ever saw. New policies had been enacted, oversight committees formed, and recruitment standards rewritten. Cases once buried were being reopened. Slowly, painstakingly, the city was trying to heal itself. Jasmine had moved into a new role, mentoring younger agents, teaching them that strength wasn't measured by the battles you could see, but by the ones you fought in silence. She lectured not about victory, but about vigilance. She reminded them that integrity demanded endurance, that justice was not a moment, but a lifelong commitment. But change came with scars. She still faced rooms where her authority was questioned before she spoke, where her skin was seen before her service. She bore it with the same steady dignity that had carried her through everything. And sometimes, alone in the early morning, Jasmine would sit by her window, watching the city slowly wake beneath the gray sky. She would remember the courtroom, the snap of the handcuffs, the weight of humiliation in the way she had stood, unbroken, when everything urged her to fall. She hadn't set out to become a symbol, but in standing firm, in refusing to be erased, she had become something stronger, proof that one voice, backed by courage and truth, could crack the very foundations of injustice. 1 year later, the fight was far from over, but so was her resolve. This story reminds us that justice is not a gift, it is a long, grueling journey. Those who stand up for what is right often face loneliness, suspicion, even wounds unseen by others. But it is precisely these people who change the world. What do you think after hearing this story? Would you be willing to stand for justice even when no one watches, even when there is no applause? As for me, I believe change begins with these silent, steadfast choices, choosing not to bow to injustice, not to stay silent in the face of wrong, and never to lose faith in doing what is right. Note: this story is entirely fictional and created for the purpose of raising awareness. It highlights issues of responsibility, justice, and the importance of treating everyone with respect and dignity. We firmly oppose violence, prejudice, and injustice in all forms. Viewer discretion is advised.